Plumes of silver blue cascaded over the oil-slicked water. It reflected and mingled with the burnt orange of the dying light. Annie hated the smoke, said it choked her and smelt. I never much minded it, liked it even. It was the visual stimulation, really, originating in a small stream from his mouth and stretching out to fill the space. Dancing shapes multiplying and morphing outward before slowly dissipating in the anticipation of being renewed by a younger, stronger exhale. I suppose it meant in later life I may well have taken up the habit too. The water was calm and high. It allowed the ship's easy entry through the mouth of the harbour. The fishing vessels were the most interesting. There was a fresh market nearby that was constantly supplied with all manner of sea life. Sometimes hideous beings, hardly of this earth, would get tangled up in their nets. They'd bring them back to scare the children and tell them equally horrific stories about battles with the beasts. There was a regular steady slew in and out, and it was pleasant to sit with dangling legs watching it pass. There was something complete in the regular rhythmic motion of it all, something to be noted in the constant cycle of back and forth. It could be harsh, too. Not a year ago, a great and deep storm had taken the harbour by surprise and had whipped the sea beyond the entrance into a frenzied pandemonium of crashing waves and howling winds. Thunder pealed ominously as fierce undulations rose and sank and rose again to reach the tallest points of the eastern and western cliffs. Just beyond the mouth and at the storm's zenith, a small junk with a modest crew was cast into view. They fought it. No hand was spared callouses in an attempt to pull away from a watery tomb. Those on the land dashed to help with tumultuous calls and harrowing wails. Some atop the western cliffs illuminated the spotlights in an effort to guide the vessel to safety. And ultimately their toils and wills and labours were fruitless. The sea swallowed its prey remorselessly, dragging the bodies down to depths far from reach. They were never recovered, and symbolic graves were placed beside a small chapel further inland. A treated oak bench was erected not long after, with a small plaque etched with words taken from Coleridge. Under the water it rumbled on, still louder and more dread. It reached the ship, it split the bay, the ship went down like lead. In the days following the tragedy, children gathered eagerly by the fishermen's nets. It seems they were hoping to spy some ghastly remnant or tormented face of some drowned ghoul. Thankfully, they were left unappeased. Dad stood and looked down at me with confliction in his features. There was an attempted feigning of contentment, but his eyes betrayed him. He flicked the end of his cigarette into the still water and it floated. I watched it linger and fall prey to a greedy gull who promptly returned it with scorn. I took Annie's hand in mine. It felt so cold and small. She smiled as I helped her to her feet and clung to me as I tried to remove my grip. "It'll be dark soon," Annie stated without any real need for reply, a simple matter of fact that could stay as it was placed. Dad's vision was fixed on the bridge, but he stood still for some time. Longer each time, I noticed. It was as though he felt by delaying the inevitable, something may change. Something could shift. Perhaps it would change. I could see the turmoil in the way he shuffled and clenched his hands. He was burning to appease the causal force, but refusing. "We'll miss the tour, Dad," I said. A momentary horror cast over his features, and he looked down at me slightly. Less so than he had each time before. It appeared that I had grown some, and the small changes made me find tiny doubts in the tradition's continuation. Not Annie, though. Never Annie. She was so innocent and unassuming. She might stay this way forever. And that thought chilled me like no other. Our hands were just so terribly small. "But if we don't go," Dad began, appealing to me. "We have to, Dad. It's trashin', Annie stamped. Tradition, Annie, I corrected softly. And she's right, Dad. We can't change it now. I could see he was still fighting, and that warmed me towards him, but only fleetingly. The emotion was promptly replaced by something deeper and older. I could see slight tinges of grey coming to his hair, but this may have only been the tricking of the light. "We're late!" shouted Annie, becoming more uneasy. We could all feel the unease and knew that any wasted time would have to be made up in the pace that we approached our home. "One day," Dad said, tears disguised by quickening blinks, "one day we'll stay here, and we will watch that sunset together." Maybe he was right, but it wouldn't be tonight. The pace at which we hurtled down the main thoroughfare of the eastern portion of the harbour was so great that I had to take Annie up into my arms. She curled a finger in the stray locks around my ear and buried her head into my jacket. Dad led, as always, and I could see that his hands had clenched to the point that his own nails were cutting into his palms. I didn't say anything. By the time we reached the end of the cobbles and approached the kissing bridge, we were almost back on track in terms of time. It allowed us to slow and Annie to walk alongside us again. "Why is it called the kissing bridge?" Annie smiled. "You always ask," I replied, returning the smile. "I like the way you tell it. I like the story." This she deliberately and adorably mispronounced, as she often would when she wanted her way. I placated. "It's said that if two people are in love," and at this she made a mock wincing face, "if two people are in love and cross the bridge and forget to kiss, then something terrible will happen. Well, a young man named Richard and his new wife Sarah were visiting from the city. He heard the curse of the kissing bridge, but scoffed and shrugged it off. 'The fool!' shouted Annie, giggling. The two ran back and forth, mocking and laughing as they did. Locals attempted to warn them. They attempted to save them from their fate. The couple wouldn't hear of it. They jeered at the small-town superstitions. 'Then what, Jamie?' Amy's eyes widened expectantly. Later that night, they returned to their hotel and fell to sleep. However, it was far from restful. Richard's head swam with dreams of strange figures with shadowy edges. They possessed the proportions of humans, but felt evil. One of the dark creatures stepped out from the ruckus. Her visage was beautiful to behold, and Richard felt his heart swell for an instant. Then he noticed the cruelness. It was subtle and hiding amongst all her other goddess-like features, but present within the glint of her eyes and the curve of her lips. With a quick swipe, there was a searing pain across his face, and everything went dark. "What then? What then?" screamed Annie, transfixed. He was awoken by a horrifying scream and more pain than he had ever felt. He looked to see Sarah recoiling in horror in the corner of the room and noticed his pillow soaked and oozing with rich, fresh blood. He tried his hardest to speak, but he could only mumble. He stood and moved over to the mirror. The reflection was exactly the same as it had always been, except for one small thing. "What, Jamie? What?" Annie cheered in delight, alive with the pleasure one finds from the macabre. Someone had taken his lips! Ah! I screamed with flailing arms, and Annie responded in kind, along with the laughter of childhood game-playing. At this, Dad turned around with anger bearing down. "Every time, Jamie, you'll scare your sister to—" Here he paused, outraged at himself for what he was about to say. I couldn't hold it in, though. I had to retaliate. What, Dad? Death? Yes, Dad. What should a child know of death? This cut him, and I almost felt sorry, but I had struck with the poetry of Wordsworth, and within the line was our shared truth. Is that why Mummy is sad? Annie remarked. It was the first time she had ever mentioned our mother. Father and I both turned towards her. What? Dad asked, aghast. Well, Mummy's sad, right? I remember her being sad before she got mad. And if you kissed her on the kissing bridge, then maybe she wouldn't be sad anymore. This was the most grown-up sentiment I had ever heard her part. And again, I was filled with a hope that was replicated underneath our father's guise of sadness. We need to keep moving, he added far more coldly than he felt. Come on, Annie, I smiled, but she read behind it and responded with a slightly lowered gaze. Not minutes later, we arrived at the small olive door that stood beside the boarded-up bakery and led up to the small attic apartment. The stairs were ancient now, and a semblance of homeliness had been scrubbed away by the erasing effects of time. The apartment itself was bare, again aged, but not vastly different to how it had been. It had 4 rooms, a small bedroom where Annie and I used to sleep, the living/bedroom that Mum and Dad would occupy, a small kitchen and a toilet. The only thing that was large about the whole place was a window which greeted you when you entered from the hallway. You could see out and down a long cobbled street, and further off you caught slight glimpses of the harbour in between the cold slate roofs of the neighbouring buildings. Annie and I sat below the window and waited, holding hands. The floor was uncarpeted, but I couldn't say it was particularly uncomfortable. I looked up at Dad and he nodded. He knew it was time to go into the kitchen. I checked the smashed face of my watch below the dried flecks of blood and agreed silently. The tour would have already started, and as usual, we would join it slightly late. This would be the part of the night which was sourest. I hated it the most. I shifted closer to Annie as we sat below the window, and I placed my hands over her small cold ears. It wasn't enough to muffle out all of the sound, but I think it made both of us feel slightly better. It started with the shouting, harsh and full of swears, then the screaming and the smashing of plates as they ricocheted from the wall to the floor. The worst noise of all was the slamming of the kitchen door and the 2-second pause before the thud of the front. It was the last noise we would ever hear our mother make. I always imagined that, as she left, she turned back, just a little, to gaze at the two of us, sitting there. I hoped she wanted to come to take us into her arms, to save us. But I never dared lift my head to look. I hope she paused, just for a moment. Dad wouldn't return for another 10 minutes, just like the first time, and we had a momentary reprieve. I moved my hand from Annie's ears and smiled down at her again. This time she smiled back. "Are you excited, Jamie?" Her question caught me off guard. "Excited?" "Yes," she nodded. "Excited for what?" "For the ghost tour." I felt an ice-cold sickness strike my stomach. Annie, why would I ever be excited about the tour? She didn't seem to notice the horror wrought upon me. "I don't know, the first few years were a little scary, I suppose, but since that, we always come back, don't we? We're never hurt for very long. Plus, I like the look on their faces." Her words sickened me. It was as though through this expression I could see that this horrific recurrence was somehow poisoning her innocence the longer she was exposed to it. I mean, it's always a new one, isn't it? She was being incredibly eloquent, and never had she spoken quite so at length or quite so clearly. She seemed mesmerized, gazing at the darkness that gathered in the corner of the room. It's never the same tour guide, Jamie. They always change them on this night, don't they? I like it. I like that we scare them so very much. I couldn't take it anymore, and for the first time, I snapped at her. No, Annie. This isn't a game. It's a curse. A curse like the kissing bridge, she giggled. No, Annie. This is real. Nightmarish and hellish. I never want to hear that you enjoy this again. Do you understand me? Annie. I softened. Annie, please. You're the only thing that gets me through. Please don't let this corrupt you. She kissed my hand and showed me a tearful sympathy. I don't ever want to let you down, Jamie. I just feel different each time. And there it was, within the confession. She too was changing. Perhaps the grey of Dad's hair, the inches in my height, and the development of Annie's understanding would someday mean something. Someday. Dad entered. There was no anger about him, and there hadn't ever been, not even the first time. His intention was never out of malice, but out of desperation. He sat between us, and mine and Annie's hands parted. He wrapped his arms around our waists tightly, and we sat there in complete silence. After a while, a voice arose from below. It was the ghost tour. And here is the site of death's most tragic. It is said that if you cast your gaze up at the window towards midnight, you may still see the window ajar and 3 figures present against the opening. There was a man this year. He sounded quite young. The father, having lost his job and being caught in a web of lies, was jaded by his wife and left alone with their 2 children. I felt Dad's grip tighten against his will as he stood and faced us towards the open window, upon which he threw himself and the 2 children. It was time. First, there's a sensation in my stomach, like driving too fast over a bump in the road. My eyes, they never see much beyond streaks of light. Then there's pain, shattering, and so much blood. The blood runs between the cobbles and mingles, it intertwines, spilling from each of our 3 bodies, tying us together. The screams are as immediate as the pain, and become one as the world swirls and catapults. The local residents' windows begin to illuminate, startled by the commotion. Although this has happened less and less over the years, I think they've become wise to it and don't care to see us anymore. For me, at least, there's always this blinding moment of warming whiteness after I begin to fade. But as I try to move towards it, I fall, and it disappears from view. I wonder, in the final moments, if Dad and Annie see it too. I shall have to ask them next time. At last, there comes the darkness, and it's so blissfully restful, a sleep that is almost as deep as death, except we always wake.